I have no problems with posting this incident. It is what happened. Spring of 2014, South Boone Country, Missouri. Driving down River Road, about 100 yards south of Cooper's Landing, along the Missouri River. We were heading out early to turkey hunt in Hartsburg Conservation Area. It was roughly 6:30 a.m., just getting light. I was driving with my brother-in-law, sitting beside me. About 30 yards in front of us, a large being jumped out of the Missouri River onto the road. It was black and wet. My headlights reflected off of the fur. It jumped onto the road and jumped up again to the bluff. It was about 8 feet tall by the trees that were there by the river. We stopped and looked up the bluff to see or hear it moving, but nothing happened. The river level was high. I don't know it could swim in the torrents and driftwood rushing in. I had never seen a wild animal like it. It moved very animated in its spring off of the road up the bluff. I will never forget what I saw. My husband and I rented a cabin in Nashville. We just came down for a year to Indiana. About 11 p.m., we went off to bed. Within minutes, our dogs went nuts. My husband got up to check and opened the front door of the cabin. It is covered by a porch, and it was raining very, very hard. The porch light doesn't work, so it was dark. He closed the door and told me to bring a flashlight and firearm. I ran out of bed and went to him by the door. He said something was breathing heavy on the porch to the left of the door. At this point, it occurred to me that our dogs were strangely silent. Being Akitas that have seen bear, wolf, coyote, and lynx all up close in Alaska, this was not exactly normal. My husband slowly opened the door again, I being sure enough that something was breathing very heavy, just to the side of the door. It also had an odor. It was really strong, musky, mixed with soggy old carpet and wet dog. We closed the door again while we chambered around, and I lit the flashlight, and we did a tactical to the left where we had heard the sound. It was gone, but wet footprints that looked like they were made with soggy, fuzzy bedroom slippers were across the floor. It had come across our front lawn and up the right side of the porch and across the door to the other side, right where we had heard it. The prints were close together while passing the first window and the door, and when it fled, it did it on one step. The footprints were a lot larger than my foot in slippers, which is a woman's 9.5 wide. I wondered if it realized what chambering around meant, since we had opened the door twice, and it stayed breathing heavy, right on the other side, right to the side where we could not see it. Dogs didn't scare it, and us two talking did not scare it. That would indicate it had human interaction, maybe with hunters before. Not uncommon with bears in Alaska. A lot of people will chamber around, not wanting to hurt it, but ready to if it becomes aggressive. They are smart and learn very fast what that sound is. Another strange thing is that the dogs paced around all night. They did not do this after confronting an 800-pound brown bear in Alaska, literally. They worked together and chased all of the above away from around the home. We lived in a cabin off the grid. Not sure if we have a stinky homeless person wearing bedroom slippers living in the woods, but it is a very strange occurrence, and my husband was career ranger, not one to let his imagination run wild. We were stumped. The dogs, 2 of them, pooped in the cabin, something dogs are known to do when frightened, and these dogs are well housebroken. While bow hunting in a field in Kansas, I observed something that I can only describe as a Sasquatch. I was sitting on a stool next to a round bale of hay near the tree line. I was near a deer scrape. As I sat watching the tree line to no avail, it began to get too dark to see my fiber optic pins on my bow. So, I began gathering my gear to make my move to my vehicle. My friend was hunting further up the tree line in the timber. After gathering my belongings there, it was still light enough to see an opening near a corn patch. As I stood up, I saw a figure, which I thought at the time was my hunting buddy. I said in a normal voice, "Did you see anything?" The figure did not reply. Upon further observation, I saw that it was walking in my general direction. It stopped next to a round bale, and I realized that the figure was at least 4 foot taller than the bale of hay. I began moving toward the tree line, as to not silhouette myself. As the figure was closing the distance to 100 to 125 yards, I began to clearly make out body features. The head was kind of high, with no visual neck. Broad shoulders, which tapered down to a slim-looking torso. The outline of the body allowed me to see that his arms, shoulders, legs were extremely muscular, like that of a professional athlete. The arms were longer than normal, and he walked in silence. As I stood there, trying to figure out who or what I was seeing, I never had a sense of fear. I had my iPhone on me, but it never dawned on me to make video, because I was in what felt like a dream, or shock. As I realized what I may be seeing, I hastily skirted the tree line to my truck. As I approached my truck, the first thing I did was open my palm and slap the hell out of my tailgate. As I hit my truck's tailgate, I then observed the figure drop down on all fours, and in 4 seconds flat, it was gone. It either used the bales as cover, or it was the fastest living thing I have ever seen move. After meeting with my buddy, he informed me that he shot an arrow at a buck, but it ricocheted off the breastplate. He then informed me that the deer was going to run in my general direction, toward the field, but the buck stopped in his tracks and looked into the field, then turned around and came running back the same direction that my buddy just shot at him from. My girlfriend and I both had Friday off, May 15th, 2020, and decided to go to one of our favorite hikes up to Silver Star Mountain in Skamania County, Washington. We live in Portland, Oregon, and go up to that hike at least once or twice a year. We regard it as one of our favorite hikes in the area due to its close proximity to home and, of course, its sheer beauty. I was born in rural southwest Missouri, and then spent my formative years growing up in Colorado. I'm an avid outdoorsman and spend a large amount of time backpacking, hiking, camping, snowboarding, and surfing in the wilderness, as well as my girlfriend. I went to school and work for environmental science and have years of experience collecting data in nature, including but not limited to animal tracking and navigation. We left around noon and arrived at the trailhead and began our hike right around 1 p.m. The hike is roughly 6.8 miles round trip and can be challenging on the way up due to the 2,000 feet elevation gain to the top of Silver Star Mountain. The trailhead was filled with cars, although most of the foot traffic we encountered was on the way up, as others were heading down. We like to hike in the afternoon for this very reason. We are both very active and fit, and didn't stop on the way up, except for once, when nature called. Near the top, we encountered some snow, as expected, but not nearly as much as the year prior. We finished the hike and were at the top of Silver Star Mountain. It was overcast with patches of sunlight, but no wind or rain, and was generally pleasant. During that time, we were alone on the craggy peak, and only a handful of other people were on the ridge to the south. The mountain is surrounded by valleys, carving through the landscape on all sides. My girlfriend is in the medical field and was on call that day. She was digging through her backpack for her work phone just to check her voicemails, since we had very limited service. I was rummaging through my pack for snacks. It was during this time that I heard the first series of very strange noises from the closest valley to the north. It was a very distinct and loud whoop whoop. The first whoop segment of noises was deep, and the second part having an extreme pitch change that I could not correlate to any known animal that I've ever heard. I asked my girlfriend if she heard it, but she was preoccupied with her phone. It was around this time that a couple of other hikers showed up with their dog. We wanted to set out on the rocks overlooking the views, so we moved slightly further down the ridge from them to a rock outcrop and ate some snacks and took pictures. In between conversation, the noise happened again from the same spot in the valley to the north. It was about 15 minutes from the first one. It was loud and filled the entire valley, giving me the feeling that it was a rather large animal. My girlfriend heard it this time, and we both looked at each other, very puzzled to say the least. The other hikers behind us were carrying on conversation and didn't seem to be paying attention to the noise, but their dog had kept going to the ridge and looking to the direction of the noise. We waited there in silence to hear it again, but unfortunately never did. We decided to head back down the trail. About halfway back down, the trail passes beneath Pyramid Rock. We had always wanted to scramble this rock to see the views and felt energized that day to do so. Pyramid Rock is comprised of loose rock and can be very dangerous to climb. We picked our line going up the north side, which was rather steep, and came to a shallow cave towards the top. It was probably 20 feet wide and 20 feet high, but maybe only 10 feet deep. There were remnants of a campfire here, as well as a 4-foot wall, or blind, made of stacked rock around the entrance. After making it to the top, we decided we were hungry, so we hightailed it back home. Upon returning home, I checked the BFRO for reports of anywhere around the area, and I found some interesting ones that described the exact area we were in. I would also like to add that the first few seconds of the Barry Moorhead whoops and knocks audio here on BFRO are nearly identical to what we had heard that day. This happened back in 1997, in June, in Washington County, Oregon. I rode my horse through this area on many occasions. It was roughly 2 years earlier, and it was still as fresh in my memory as yesterday. On this summer day, my friend and I had just crossed a creek and were riding to the bottom of a ridge. It is a game trail. I was the lead ride, and my German Shepherd was on my heels, with my friend being behind me. In the distance, approximately 120 yards, I saw first what I thought was a bear, foraging. It saw me and took off on 2 feet, straight up this ridge. My dog ran after it, and she was gone for a half an hour. I could not ride my horse where I believe what I saw was a Sasquatch. I took another game trail and galloped to the top and into a wheat field. I called and called for my dog, and she did return eventually, pretty tired. My friend never saw a thing. This event happened so fast, in a blink of an eye. It was dark blackish, and I have to believe it was young. Not broad, just stocky. I was just 16 years old. My brother's best friend had been over earlier that day. He needed a ride home, and so I asked my parents if I could take him home. They said yes, so the three of us got into my dad's 1980 Ford Ranger F-150, which was four-wheel drive and seemed somewhat lifted. I would say the truck stood an easy 6 foot tall. So, my brother's friend lived about 2 to 3 miles from us, but off a dirt gravel road. It was a clear night, and it was pretty dark out at this time, since, after all, this was December. As I rounded the final turn to his house, my lights caught something in front of us. This bipedal being stood, an easy 7 foot tall, was covered in light brown fur, and jumped into the ditch on a single leg. Jumped the fence to keep the cattle in. This was impossible for any person to do. I couldn't believe what I just saw. My brother's friend leaned over and said, "Did you just see that?" So, all three of us seen Bigfoot that night, many, many years ago. Hiking the Seven Sisters Trail from Mount Holyoke to the Notch in the Hadley-Amherst area of Massachusetts. My hiking partner and I got to Taylor's Notch and can hear the wind ripping through, making eerie noises. We both heard a lot of whistling and breaking branches, which I just initially attributed to the wind going through the rocky ledges of Taylor's Notch. We hiked over one large hill, and the wind was lessening, but we realized the whistling was closer, and there were whooping noises and calls along with the whistles. The calls were going back and forth, and that's when I realized we were surrounded. We kept talking loudly, hoping to scare off any animals, and I kept my bear spray in hand for the next mile. Not sure what it was, but highly unusual, and did not sound like a grown or baby bear, canine, coyote, mountain lion, or fox. I frequently hike and spend a lot of my time outdoors. I am at a loss as to what to say or what it was with us. I'm gonna go back soon to see if I can find out more. I had some strange experiences in my childhood. A friend from up the street, she and I would walk through the woods together. There was a path that went in a big circle where the older neighborhood kids would ride dirt bikes. It was about a mile around, I'd say. When we'd get about 2/3 the way around this circle, we'd hear single short whistles and small stones that would be tossed near us. We thought it was the neighborhood kids, so kind of ignored it. But this would happen every time we walked around in that section of woods. About 3/4 the way around the circle, we saw some matted down dry grass that looked a lot like a bedding area. Also, some strange footprints as well in the muddy areas. They were huge footprints, and the toes seemed almost rectangular in the dried footprints. We'd also smell a wet dog type smell in this area. The last time I was in that section of woods was probably around 1975 to 1976. A couple of other times, I'd go with a friend to the Howl, Farmingdale area. We'd walk back to an abandoned house in the woods and drink a few beers. We'd hear noises and saw some of the same sized footprints that the neighbor and I had seen in the woods directly behind my neighborhood. Fast forward 5 years or so, a boyfriend and I were smoking cigarettes in the school field by the house that I grew up in. It was fall, just at dusk, probably 6 p.m.-ish. I happened to look up and look across the school field and saw this huge shadow standing on a slightly raised hill across the school field, by another neighborhood. I stared at that figure for a minute, thinking that person sure has long arms. It was probably 60 feet away from us at the time. I stared a minute more, and suddenly, I could see that figure crystal clear as it bolted across the school field towards us. As it got closer, I could see reddish-brown shaggy fur on this huge man-ape type creature. It ran towards us silently, but with huge strides. As it came closer and closer, all I could do was yell, "Run!" And we ran through a neighbor's yard and back to my house. I told my mother what happened, and she said we shouldn't have been in the school field when it was getting dark. I was petrified, and the next day, my boyfriend and one of his friends went back to look for this thing, but we never found it again. I very recently talked to my son about this incident and even wrote it out for him, as I wanted my story documented. I still, to this very day, get goosebumps every time I talk about it. This happened just this year, around 9 Mile Falls, Washington. What I heard, at approximately 2:15 a.m., my Labrador Retriever began barking at something outside. This is not unusual, as we live on a closed golf course, which is adjacent to Riverside State Park, and we often have varying types of nature near our home. After letting the dog out to relieve himself, I returned to bed. Outside temp was approximately 60 degrees, and we had the bedroom windows open. Our bedroom faces the closed golf course. What I heard next was a very loud howl. At first, I thought it was a police car or an ambulance traveling on Highway 291 that had turned on its siren. But then the sound simply went from soft to loud, to suddenly stopping. So it was not a siren. I listened intently to try and figure out what was going on, and about 2 minutes later, I heard a similar but more faint siren sound. This was not a coyote nor a wolf, or was it the sound of a neighbor's dog. It was different, and as I said, it sounded like a siren with only one long continuous woo. I noted the time, 2:20 a.m. exactly. It sounded like it could have been a few blocks away. I have been checking local websites and Facebook groups to see if anybody else has heard it, but so far nothing. I can't be the only one to have heard this. Perhaps a person who is making the noise is a part of Bigfoot hunting, maybe. The other thing I'd like to add is that we feed birds and squirrels in our yard. Approximately 6 weeks prior, we had our squirrel feeder torn off the tree at night. We heard a crashing outside and could not identify anything that particular night. But the following morning, however, we discovered the feeder's lid, which is screwed on into the top on a very heavy hinge, was ripped off completely. We jokingly said maybe we should look for Bigfoot prints or hair in the area. Anyway, the howl was definitely something not of the ordinary. We were on a drive from our home, 8 miles east of Sheldon, Missouri, to our grandson's in Wheatland, Missouri. We bought our other grandson a new used car and was learning to drive it. This was his first long drive, about 45 minutes. It rained on and off, fairly heavy, and he was white-knuckling it. His grandpa sat shotgun, and I crammed my butt in the fancy deep bucket seat and back. I stared out the window to keep myself from backseat driving, letting John deal with Haven's sketchy handling of the Cougar, a sleek black 2-door. We were coming up on another stand of thick forest when I saw your typical Bigfoot running in the woods parallel to our vehicle. I wanted to scream, "Look, it's Bigfoot," but I knew we'd end up upside down in the highway ditch, probably dead. I then thought of getting John's attention, but being your typical old man, he'd blow it, and we'd end up upside down in the ditch. I wanted somebody else to see it, but every scenario left us dead in a ditch, so I clammed up and stared. It was at least doing our speed, about 40 miles an hour. Then, the massive dark figure turned into the woods deeper, and I lost it. It ran just like a man, was very thick and covered in hair, much too large to be a human, running in an agile, fast-moving fashion. This was in fall rain in 2016. In February of 2011, I was traveling down Highway 95 between an area of Idaho, around midnight to 2 in the morning. It was thickly wooded pasture off to the right side of the highway, and open grass pasture and creek on the left. I was driving into a curve around a private road area when approximately 50 feet in front of me, I saw a very large, dark form walk straight across the highway, right to left. I assumed it was a human, so I slowed to a full stop in the middle of a highway, which was empty, both directions, except for me. It was at this point that I realized that I could not see this person off the side of the highway, or out in the grass pasture to my left. I had my high beams on, and the area was very well lit from that. I developed an awful sense of dread, and immediately hit the gas and headed for home, which was around 5 to 6 miles away. I was so bothered by this event that I continually checked my rearview mirror, fully expecting to see something horrible or have something horrible happen to me. Once I got home, I bolted into the house, turned on all the lights, and woke my family up. They kind of laughed it off, but my dog had crawled up into my lap and whined and cried at me and would not leave my side. I definitely did not sleep that night and started avoiding driving that highway so late at night. It wasn't until later that I really started to process the details of what happened. I realized that I saw someone, very distinctly bipedal, walk across the highway. I remember the walking motion of the legs and the slight swinging motion of the arms. I also realized that while I had my high beams on the figure, it was completely black. No reflection from clothes, shoes, or even a shadow thrown onto the highway. The other thing that very much bothered me was that I never took my eyes off of what happened, but somewhere between the figure walking across the highway and walking off the side, it disappeared. I definitely should have been able to see something walking down the side of the ditch or into the pasture, but it was completely empty. It took me quite some time to come to terms with what happened, and even longer before I admitted to myself that it may indeed have been a Sasquatch-related sighting. I've recently been compelled to report this specific sighting due to the fact that very recently, a woman has claimed to have seen a Sasquatch right before hitting a deer in almost the exact same area and a similar time frame. But she's been made into a joke in the local news. I don't know if she actually saw a Sasquatch, but I find it a very, very odd coincidence that it happened in that area of the highway in the same time frame. I was getting ready for bed one night at our upper house here on Black Mountain in North Carolina. There was no development at this time, so the woods behind the house would still be considered wilderness. We had a cat that was not supposed to be in the house, so when he ran inside and hid under our bunk beds, I had to go and get him. I bent down to pick him up from under the bed, and as I stood back up, I looked out the window that was right in front of me. As I looked out at the starry sky, I was shocked, if not terrified, to see the dark outline of a strange figure walking past the window. Because of the treetops, I could only see the top half of the body, but I would estimate it to be at least 7 feet tall. It looked very large and lofty. I knew it couldn't be anybody that was on the mountain at the time. The shape of the head was that of a man with a mullet, so you couldn't make out the contour of the back of the head. It sort of went straight down. One thing I remember thinking was strange about the way it walked. It swung its arms as it walked, kind of like pendulums. The time was dusk, and the weather was pretty clear, and there were no clouds in the sky because I could see the stars very easily. The moon was also giving off more light than usual, so it was a great backdrop for a silhouette. I had a pretty good sighting of this thing. In the fall of 1986, I was driving up a lone mountain road in North Carolina. The road turned to dirt and gravel about halfway up. About 35 to 40 feet after, it dropped off the pavement. I noticed something standing beside a big tree. At first, I thought it was a bear, maybe scratching itself on the tree. But as I got closer, it did not run off. I've drove up on bears before, and they always ran off. Except this animal didn't run. It just kind of watched me go by. It was about dusk, dark. I couldn't really make it out that well. But I can tell you that it stood on 2 legs, and it was upright like a man. It had long darkish hair hanging from its arms and legs. Its head came to kind of a point at the very top. If I had to guess, I'd say it stood between 6.5 to 7.5 feet tall and weighed roughly 500 pounds. It turned its head kind of watching me drive by. I hit my brakes but was already past it, so it went on quickly to the end of the road and turned around. I drove back down the road, and as I neared the tree, I slowed down and rolled down my window, determined to see what this was, but it was already gone. I could not bring myself to get out of the car and inspect the area. At least not then. I went back the next morning to look for tracks. As I went up the road, I saw people coming down. I saw one of my friends. He was waving me to stop from his open window. I stopped and asked what was going on. He said the road was blocked. The big tree in the bend had fallen across the road. I didn't know at the time till I got up there that it was the exact tree that thing was standing beside. There were some folks' chainsaws cutting in the tree out in the road, and doing so, obliterating any tracks that may have been there. It was dark, and we noticed we were running low on firewood. This was back in October in 2001. We walked down a trail on the south side of the campsite to get some wood from a small clearing that we had noticed earlier. We were watching some lights move across Brown Mountain, trying to determine if they were the Brown Mountain lights. Apparently, this is a locally known phenomenon, or just motorcycles. At any rate, it was about this time we heard the noise. We had our flashlights off because we were watching the lights on Brown Mountain. Then, we heard this long scream. We stopped in our tracks and listened very carefully. The scream repeated. It was coming from the southwest of our location, deep in the valley. We hurried back up to camp and turned off the radio in the truck. The screaming continued. Now, this has been going on for a couple of minutes, and the scream changed. It would scream for a few seconds, and then the sound would start to break up. At the time, we described it as a crackle-like sound, but the newspaper article that we found described it as a yodeling, which is probably more accurate. This continued on for several minutes. Every few seconds, another scream continuing on to the yodel. Both of us are avid campers and camp in the same area every October, but we had never heard a sound like this before. We first thought perhaps a mountain lion, because we had heard their cries compared to a woman in pain, screaming. We debated for a while, and at last decided to move to another campsite for the night, as we had not explored our surroundings much prior to nightfall. We have yet to be back, but we have full intentions on going back and exploring the valley from which the sound came. Leaving from Wilson Mills, North Carolina, I went to visit with my fiancée and her family in Taylorsville, Hickory, North Carolina, on October 15th, 2012. On October 18th, 2013, around 5:45 p.m., I left to go meet her and her nephews to take them to a haunted trail for Halloween after she had gotten off work. I left from their mobile home and turned right onto Friendship Church Road in Taylorsville to get on the 16. It is about 5 miles from their home on Friendship Church Road to Highway 16. About 30 seconds after I pulled out of the driveway onto the road, I looked into an open field on the left, and they sell grapes. There's a dirt road that leads to the Vineyard area, and about 30 to 40 yards off the road, and about 15 yards off of the dirt road, was the time where I thought a bear was sitting on its butt. I only saw it for about 4 seconds while passing. I got down the road, about 1/8 of a mile, and turned around in a local church parking lot. When I got back, there was yet another vehicle turned into the dirt path. I slowed down and rolled my windows down, and the lady asked me, "Do you see that thing?" Which I didn't see it anymore. She then pointed. I looked, and it was walking on 2 legs into the tree line. We then spoke for a few more minutes before I left. I told her I turned around to get another look. I knew that it was not a bear after I saw it walking on 2 legs, just like a man. While on vacation, my family and I were camping at Linville Trailer Lodge and Campground in Linville, North Carolina. On June 15th, 2010, we were all sleeping in our pop-up camper. At 2 in the morning, I was woken up by the sound of an animal to the southeast of our camper. Its calls were 4 short whoops, followed by 1 double whoop. After listening to that for a couple of minutes, I heard another one calling from the northwest. Its call was 3 short whoops, followed by a double whoop. While listening to that one, another one from the northwest started calling. Its calls were 2 short whoops, followed by a double whoop. After a couple of minutes, I could hear them calling and moving towards the northeast. It sounded like they were within 100 yards of our camper, but I was the only one that got woken up. On June 17th, we got ready for bed at around 9 p.m., and around 9:30 p.m., I could hear the same calls as the second and third animals from the 2 nights prior. They were much farther away this time. My 8-year-old daughter heard them and also asked what kind of animal makes that sound. I did not answer her. After we got home, I got onto the website and played the whoops and knocks from the Sierra Nevada mountains. My daughter came running from her bedroom and said that is what I heard the other day. Then I explained to her what it is she heard. In 1977 to 1978, I lived in Sandwich, Massachusetts. We were the last house in the neighborhood I was living in. Behind us was the woods that ran for an entire mile or more in each direction. One snowy Saturday in December, I was home alone, watching TV. My parents worked frequently, and even though I was only around 12 years old at the time, I was home alone a lot. I was watching TV in our den, which was situated between 2 windows. It was around noon and overcast. My dog frequently barked whenever a car drove up. When she started barking this time, I turned my head down our hallway to yell at her to shut up. Looking back to the TV, I was startled to see a face peering through my window. To the best of my memory, the face was furry. Whatever it was only around 5 to 6 feet tall. I screamed, and it made some kind of grunting noise. It immediately took off around the back of the house, running on 2 legs, and through an open breezeway to the front and into the woods. To say I was frightened was an understatement. I immediately called some friends who came over to calm me down. After thinking about it for a while, I thought it could have been one of my friends wearing a mask and playing a joke on me. That theory ended when we went outside to see what the creature's footprints looked like. We were shocked to see hoofed footprints. I never saw any sign of this creature again. But after reading what the men in Mashpee saw 2 to 3 years prior, it sounded like Cape Cod might have a Bigfoot of some kind. I have been a believer that Bigfoot exist for years, just based on how many people have reported seeing or hearing something over hundreds and hundreds of years. I am 64 years old and have been hiking and camping ever since I was about 12 years old, and I have seen and heard many things in the woods. On February 27th, 2016, my friend Dean and I set out for an overnight camping trip in Mount Washington State Forest in Mass. I always record our adventures on video, but this time, I decided to run an MP3 recorder all night and get the sounds of the night. I did get what I think was a bobcat walking up to my tent, but around 2 in the morning, I was awake again because it was very cold and hard to sleep. I was only half awake when I heard a very loud noise, but not awake enough to really tell what it was, except that it was a good ways off. I knew I was recording audio, so I noted the time so I can find it on my recorder and went back to sleep. Or at least I tried to. When I got home, I found the sound on my MP3 recorder, and it sounds a lot like a wood knock. But judging by the amount of echo and how loud it was from so far away, it had to be something very big that made that noise. I do not think that even Babe Ruth could swing a bat fast and hard enough to make that sound. First, some details on the location. After 9/11, the government closed the thruway that runs alongside the reservoir that feeds Springfield its water supply. These mountains have been off limits to hunters, hikers, fishermen, and the public for years previous to 9/11. Now it's completely blocked off. Lots of deer and wildlife in this large expanse of protected mountainous terrain. The reservoir holds lots of smallmouth bass, rainbow trout, brook, and brown trout. My uncle worked at the pumping station. He let me and my cousin fish there. I stayed there for weeks at a time, and as an adult, I couldn't help myself to go fishing there still. I respected the land and put all fish back and wouldn't throw any trash around. I packed it up and brought it back with me. I fished there all day sometimes, but mostly at night with topwater poppers for smallmouth bass. I parked up the road a ways so any cops or ranger patrol cars didn't see my car. It was about 1 a.m., with 3/4 of the moon showing. The water was very low this day. I was fishing, and there was about 4 beaver tail slaps on the water. I was trying to get a fish off the hook that I had caught, when I heard something very heavy, about 45 yards away from me, cracking sticks as it approached me from the road onto the freshly cut brush, from the work they did around there days prior. It sounded like a human walking, and I thought I was in trouble with the law. My flashlight was dying, and I was having trouble seeing just getting the fish off my 2 treble hooks. I asked, "Who's there?" And I just heard a stick snap, really loud, as it stood still. I hit my flashlight in order to make it brighter, and I seen big eye shine and a dark silhouette of what looked to be shoulders. I started yelling at it to get out of here, and at this point, I'm thinking deer, or worse, maybe a bear standing up. I heard a few more big snaps as it walked onto the paved road, and that's when it cried out, in this terrible noise that I've never heard before. It echoed through the mountains, and it scared the bejesus out of me. It was not a bear, or a deer, that's for sure. It was huge, and the sound of it made it sounded like a shrieking demon baby. That's the only way I could describe it. A loud shrieking howl. It wasn't a roar or a deep growl. It was much more high-pitched. I cut my line with a lure, still in the fish's mouth, and kicked the fish haphazardly into the water and ran as fast as I could to my car, which was the scariest run, walk, stop, and listen journey to my car that I've ever had in my life. I was waiting for a werewolf to jump out and get me, or something. True terror like that, I've never experienced to this day. In November of 1996, just a couple of days before Thanksgiving, my best friend and I were camping and deer hunting in a forestry land in southeastern Oklahoma. The nearest town would be Smithville, but even at that, it would be somewhere 9 miles as the crow flies. Land has since been sold to John Hancock Corporation. This area is in the same general area as where my written report occurred. This area is used to grow soft pine trees for harvesting to grind into paper pulp. The total area is something around 800,000 acres. So, you can imagine how big of an area this is. There are no homes or anybody living at all. In fact, you are not even allowed to build any permanent hunting cabins or such. By this time of 1996, I had actually all but given up gun deer season. I was almost strictly a bow hunter. About 3 years before, I was actually in a tree stand and had a bullet go over my head. Some idiot was out there somewhere. Never seen him, but heard the shot, but never seen the guy that pulled the trigger. Anyway, he was out there just taking pot shots. I had decided after that, I would just stay with my bow hunting. However, my buddy wanted me to go with him as he was alone. So, I decided to go ahead and accompany him. The area that we camped is in an area that is very difficult to get to, and rarely does anybody go into this area. You have to exit off a logging road and travel up this very steep clear cut that climbs up a small mountain. This is really not even a road as such that you have to travel along. At one time, the loggers just took a dozer and cut a path the width of the dozer from the bottom of the mountain all the way up and then along the crest of the mountaintop. And this path is never maintained, so it gets very rough, and only a 4x4 can get through. And even with that, you have to drive at a speed little more than walking. This path travels about 3 miles, and simply dead ends, just at the start of the downward side of the mountain. Me and my buddy call it the dish. We call it that because you are traveling up this mountain in heavy forest, make a curve, then suddenly you are facing down, and at the bottom is an area that very much resembles a satellite dish, where it is void of trees, and the concave shape of the ground gives the impression of a satellite dish. This clear area is roughly 30 feet or so in diameter. So, we make the journey up the mountain and take the treacherous path up to the dish. There, we make our camp, and it of course becomes our home away from home for the next few days. It was a bit odd. Normally, you see 1 or 2 hunting camps once you enter the area from the highway. But this time, we see not one camp or hunter. Now to take note, The dish from the highway is roughly 14 miles. Now, of course, that is not straight line miles, because you know how access and logging roads rarely ever run straight for any distance. On day 3 of our hunting trip, we get up before daylight, as usual, and get ready to go out into nature and see if we can find any deer. After all, that was why we were there. Even so, I had seen nothing the previous 2 days, but didn't really care because, as usual, I was very much enjoying myself with the flora and fauna. I'm also very interested in geology, and there is much to see in that area. To imagine that area at one time was a shallow sea never ceases to amaze me. I wish when I first took my geology course in college, I would have changed my major and pursued that field further. Oh, sorry there, got off track. We decided that which directions we were going to go, and we planned for our rendezvous back at the dish for 12 noon. We walked together for about half a mile, camp, and there we split up. My buddy continues to the west, along the top of the mountain, and I head south down the side of the mountain. Being that it was not yet daylight, these woods are very thick and dangerous to walk in during the daylight hours due to the rough, rocky terrain. I was not about to do any walking until first light. So, after we split, I only walked for about 10 yards or so and sat down and waited for a few more minutes until the sun decided to come up. At sunup, I get up and start my hunt. I normally am not a stalker for a couple of reasons. To be a successful stalker, you must have proper coordination to walk and not make noise. Also, you really need a lot of stamina. I possess neither of those traits, so I normally hunt from some type of stand. But I had sat for several hours the evening before and was ready to move. Plus, I wanted to do some exploring into a saddle that I had never been into before, so this day, I decided to stalk. Here's an important note. I am using the term saddle here and will continue using that term. However, it really is not a saddle as such. A saddle is the gap between 2 mountains where they run close together. This area is on the same mountain, but it has 2 ridges, or fingers extending out away from the mountain, making a gap and valley in between these 2 parallel fingers, much like a saddle. Imagine, if you will, make a fist with your left hand. Then, after you make a fist, extend your index and middle finger out, like you are making the peace sign. Your hand is the mountain, and your 2 extended fingers are these fingers that extend out from the mountain. The width of this finger is, I'm guessing, somewhere around 150 yards, but could not see all the way through because of the trees. I will be walking down the eastern finger, which in the above example would be your middle. Your index will be the western finger, or ridge. I hate using the term ridge because it's too vague. The distance between these 2 fingers were only roughly 50 yards apart at the mountain, and by the time you get out to the tips, they are nearly 100 yards apart. So, technically, they are not parallel, either do they diverge some, and the length of finger I am on is about 300 yards in length. Never went up there, so I have no clue how wide it is across. Also, the crest of that finger is about 20 to 30 yards higher than the one I am on. There's the end of that note. So, I start walking down the mountainside, and after about an hour and a half, I reach the eastern finger of the saddle. I start walking down the mountainside, and after about a half an hour, I reach the eastern finger of the saddle. I sit for a few minutes to rest and catch my breath before taking out down this finger of the saddle. On this finger, I could view the saddle valley to my right, and also could see the eastern side of the western finger of the saddle. From the top of the finger, I was walking, I could see very clearly down to the bottom of the saddle, which, again, was no more than 100 feet to the floor to the nearest mountain. And as you walked the top of the finger away from the mountain, this finger sloped downward toward the valley, so that by the time the finger ended, the valley within the saddle was no more than 50 feet from the peak of the finger. So, from my 12 o'clock position to 180 degrees to my right, clockwise, I had a totally unobstructed view, with the exception of the trees in the saddle's valley. But I had a clear enough view that if a deer was in there or came through that valley, there was no way I would miss seeing it. This particular course gave me a good look at the western finger face. Although with many trees on it, there were several spots that had no trees, and the rocks were exposed, which would give me a chance to look to see if I could distinguish the types of rocks over there. I could also watch the ridge top of the western finger and see anything coming over the top. Over to my right, across the top of this finger, is heavily wooded, with mainly hardwoods. However, there were some pine trees among them. This is old growth trees from hardwood, like oaks and hickory, and are quite large. It is heavily wooded enough that even in the bright sun, it is fairly dark, and they're only a few feet in. Not dark enough that you can't see, but you certainly would not need sunglasses in there. It, just like up in the dish, gets dark in there long before the sun is fully set. There is very little undergrowth in this area because it is so sunlight challenged, and the spacing between trees are fairly wide, so that if anything of any size moved through, you would have no trouble sighting it. This tree line extends almost all the way to the edge of this finger. You would have maybe 5 feet of space to walk the length of the finger clear of trees. From the edge of this finger, I am on in some places are straight down into the valley. The only way to get on this finger is from the direction I came, or, as I will speak to later, would be from the very end of the tip. So, I slowly stalked down this finger, keeping just inside the tree line, as to not be exposed to the valley floor and the western finger. I stalked very slowly along in no hurry whatsoever, understanding that stalking means walk a few steps, stop, wait, listen, and repeat. I stalked nearly the entire length of this finger and decide I needed a break, so I walk out of the tree line to a spot that is actually clear of trees. There was a very fine-looking stump there that actually looked like it was made for my butt, and it was high enough that I did not have to bend my knees very far. I figured I would sit there for a while and rest my legs. Then, I would finish walking all the way. Then, head back because we were to hook back up at noon, and by now, it was roughly 9:30, and I was a good 3 miles from camp and had a very hard climb back up the mountain. As I was sitting on my stump, I looked down the finger out to the tip. At the tip was a huge oak tree. I'm 5'10", and it would have took 2 of me to wrap my arms around this giant tree. As I was looking at this tree and trying to figure out how a tree can grow to that size in such little soil, I then noticed, just off to the right of this tree, a figure walking up below the tip of the finger. The figure was bright in sunlight, so I immediately recognized it as walking on 2 feet, and he appeared to me to be walking with his head down. But my first thought was, what an idiot. It is deer season, and if you are on hunting, you are required to wear blaze orange, and this guy had none. Even if you are not hunting, it is a good idea if you're out in the woods. Now, granted, I had only seen one human in 3 days, and that was my hunting partner. And even though there were no humans for miles, I, for one, would never take a stupid chance like that. I guess that I should also mention that during the deer gun season, logging operations cease and the loggers go home. The companies do not want their employees getting plugged by some knucklehead hunter. So I knew that this guy was not a logger, Then the next question came to my mind. How did this guy get there? There is no logging road in that direction for a very long way. And from the nearest road, it is a long haul to the point. And that haul would not be easy at all. In fact, that area is very inaccessible, even by an ATV. The next thought, no, he is not a hunter, nor is he carrying a rifle, or have one slung on his shoulders. Now, remember, all these thoughts were processed in my head in a matter of microseconds, while this guy was walking slowly up this slope to the top of this finger that I'm on. Then, the next thought through my mind, gosh, that conehead from the movie with hair, because his head was very pointy. Next thought, my God, those are big shoulders. Then my next thought, why is he wearing a mink coat? My next thought, did God forget to give this guy a neck? It looked to me as his head was attached directly to his shoulders. Then, this guy finally reaches the top and stands directly beside that big oak I was looking at just moments ago. Next thought, that is one big mother effer. I have seen many football games, and some of those have been up in the nosebleed section, and those guys even that high up look big. But this was different. I am now 83 yards from this guy, and he is the biggest, largest person I have ever seen, bar to none. Then, the big guy looks up and looks directly at me, out in front. It was then I realized, okay, I'm not looking at any man, but not really an animal either, it didn't seem. Now, let me attempt to explain what this big guy did. Imagine yourself standing, looking straight ahead at some target, and right next to you, and slightly in front of you to your right, is a big tree. Your desire now is to get behind that tree with little movement as possible. What you would most likely do is simply lift your left foot and pivot 90 degrees counterclockwise on your right foot, with your head and neck frozen in place to watch your target while moving. That is what he done. Next thought, do I have any clean underwear back at camp? 'Cause me thinks I need them. Then the fight or flight response kicked in, but I forced myself to stop and think and evaluate. It was then I determined that 83 yards. Didn't know it was exactly 83 at the time. I went and marked off the distance later on. I was actually guessing at the time 100. There was no way, no matter how fast he was, that he could cover that much distance before I put at least 3 bullets in him. The big guy was now standing behind the oak, watching me. Then suddenly, he popped behind the tree, and I couldn't see him. So at that point, I slowly got up and moved behind that little tree near me. Then I peeked around the basketball-sized tree. And by the way, at that time, I was beach ball size, so you can see the tree really offered me no concealment to see what was happening. By the time I looked back up, he was once again peeking out from behind the tree. Now this time, I thought that poor guy is deformed somehow, because there appeared to be some kind of growth just around and below his throat. I could not make it out, but definitely could see discoloration, and could see that there was something there that did not belong. I was straining as hard as I could to make out the facial features of this guy, but I try as I might, there was simply no way I could make out any details of his face. My one real regret in this entire experience. Anyway, we just kind of stared at each other for a couple of seconds. Then, he popped back behind the tree, so I'd done the same thing the best I could. Here I am in an area with trees the size of Volkswagens, and leave me to pick up a sapling to hide behind. After a couple of seconds behind a tree, I pop my head and don't see him, but I stay in that position a couple more seconds. Then the big guy pops out his head again and looks at me. Now, I'm really confused because the growth seemed to be on his throat is now over on the top where a clavicle would be. I don't know what is going on. It is just too far away to make out fine detail. Someone with better vision probably would have been able to make things out better. Now, here it becomes surreal, and I don't know if I can put into words the way the situation seemed to instantly change. One moment, I am so tense, you could not have driven a straight pin at my butt with a 16-pound sledgehammer. The very next second, a calming came over me, and somehow, I just had a feeling that there was nothing to be concerned about. So while he was looking at me, I purposely leaned my rifle up against the stump I was just sitting at with him, watching me. I just got the distinct feeling that he knew that I meant no harm and had no intention of doing anything to him. Maybe not, maybe. I am just reading more into that than I should. For lack of a better word, we basically played peekaboo for another 2 minutes, popping back and forth. After a total of just about 3 minutes, he very suddenly snaps around the other direction. I was thinking, what on earth? Then, I heard what he heard, a very large snap coming from the woods on top of this finger. Then the big guy turns, and keeping the tree between me and him, he simply just walks off. He did not run or even walk particularly fast. He was walking a bit faster than leaving than he did, but not in any panic. I figured if it was something that made him want to leave the area, I better figure out quick what made that noise. So I picked up my rifle and immediately began scanning. I want so badly to walk over to the tip to see if I can glimpse a big guy, but I don't care until I resolve this issue. After a few minutes of searching and listening to the noise, I finally tracked the source of the noise maker. A friggin' tank rat. I missed a possible chance to get a better look at that guy because of a tank rat, which is my personal term for armadillo. As stated above, after the incident, I walked off the distance and also solved one of the mysteries. The abnormal growth on this guy was not on Big Guy at all. It was on the tree. It was a viral knot about the size of a softball. Standing under the knot, I could barely touch the bottom of it with my fingers, standing on my tiptoes and arms extended as far as I could. I found no tracks whatsoever, even though I knew the exact location of where he walked up and back from. But the ground was hard pan, and even a D9 bulldozer would have been hard-pressed to leave any marks or tracks there.